In 1987, NASA classified 7 incident reports under the code name Deep Echo Protocol, files that were never meant to see public light. These weren't equipment failures or technical malfunctions. These were encounters that challenged everything we thought we knew about what exists in the infinite darkness beyond our planet. Tonight, I'm sharing these suppressed accounts with you, stories that come directly from the mouths of trained astronauts, engineers, and mission specialists who risked their careers to document what they witnessed in the void. Each incident involves experienced professionals who underwent years of psychological evaluation, people who knew that reporting unexplained phenomena could end their careers forever. Yet they spoke anyway, because what they encountered out there was too terrifying to keep silent about. These aren't theories or speculation. These are declassified testimonies from men and women who ventured into the deepest reaches of space and discovered that we are not alone. And more disturbing still, that whatever is out there has been watching us, studying us, and in some cases, following us home. Before we begin this journey into the most classified corners of space exploration, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because these are the stories that governments don't want you to hear, and you won't want to miss what happens next. What you're about to hear will change how you look at the night sky forever. Story 1. Commander Sarah Chen had been aboard the classified orbital research station Echo 7 for exactly 93 days when she first noticed the shadows moving outside her observation window. At first, she dismissed it as debris or perhaps a trick of Earth's terminator line as the station passed from daylight into the planet's shadow during its orbital cycle. But on the 94th day, during her routine hull inspection using the external cameras, Sarah realized these weren't random shadows at all. They were geometric, precise, and they moved with deliberate purpose across the station's exterior hull plating. The shapes appeared only during Earth's shadow periods, when the station was completely cut off from solar radiation, floating in the absolute darkness of space. Sarah began documenting these anomalies in her personal log, careful not to include them in official mission reports. The shadows started small, simple triangular forms that seemed to glide along the station's surface like liquid mercury. By day 100, they had grown larger and more complex, forming intricate patterns that resembled mathematical fractals or perhaps some form of written language. Sarah's training as an astrophysicist told her this was impossible. Shadows require a light source and an object to cast them, but in Earth's shadow, there was no light source for millions of miles. Yet there they were, dark forms darker than the void itself, moving with intelligence and purpose. On day 107, Sarah made a discovery that shattered her rational worldview completely. While reviewing her camera footage, she noticed that the shadow patterns weren't random at all. They were forming recognizable shapes. First, they outlined the exact dimensions of the station itself, as if mapping every bolt and panel. Then they began forming shapes that corresponded to the interior layout of Echo 7, showing the precise locations of each room, corridor, and equipment bay. But most terrifying of all, the shadows began forming human silhouettes in the exact positions where Sarah spent most of her time. They knew where she slept, where she worked, where she ate her meals. The shadows were studying her just as intently as she was studying them. Sarah's psychological evaluation reports, recovered after the station's emergency evacuation, document a steady decline in her mental state as the shadow encounters intensified. She reported feeling constantly watched, even when inside the station's sealed compartments. She began sleeping in different locations each night, trying to disrupt whatever pattern the entities were mapping. But no matter where she moved, the shadows adjusted their formations accordingly, always maintaining perfect accuracy about her location and movements. On day 123, Sarah's final personal log entry contained a chilling revelation. The shadows had begun forming new patterns, shapes that depicted scenes from Sarah's childhood on Earth, her family's house, the playground where she played as a child, even the classroom where she first became interested in space exploration. Somehow, these entities were accessing her memories, her most private thoughts and experiences. The official incident report states that Commander Chen requested emergency evacuation due to acute psychological distress related to extended isolation. But Sarah's recovered personal files tell a different story entirely. In her final transmission to Mission Control, a recording that was immediately classified and removed from all official documentation, Sarah's voice is barely a whisper as she describes watching the shadows form a perfect replica of her childhood bedroom, complete with the small details only she could know: the crack in the ceiling plaster, the way her stuffed animals were arranged on her bed, even the pattern of sunlight that used to stream through her window on summer mornings. But then Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In this shadow recreation of her childhood room, there was an additional figure she didn't remember being there, a dark silhouette standing in the corner, watching her younger self sleep. Sarah realized with growing horror that these entities hadn't just been observing her during her time on the station. They had been watching her entire life, present at every moment, cataloging every detail of her existence from childhood to present day. The shadows weren't just studying humanity from a distance. They had been among us all along, invisible observers documenting our species with patient, methodical precision. Station Echo 7 was evacuated 3 days later, and Sarah Chen disappeared during the rescue operation. The official report claims she suffered a psychological break and was transferred to a secure medical facility, but no record of her admission exists at any hospital or treatment center. The station itself was declared a total loss due to critical system failures, and all research data was classified under national security protocols. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the shadow phenomena didn't end with Sarah's disappearance. Similar reports have surfaced from other space installations, always following the same pattern: geometric shadows appearing during dark orbital periods, gradually forming more complex patterns, and always seeming to focus their attention on isolated crew members who spend too much time observing them. Mission Control has quietly implemented new protocols requiring all personnel to avoid extended observation of exterior space during shadow periods, but they refuse to explain why. Sarah Chen's final log entry, recovered from the station's backup systems weeks after the evacuation, contained a single, terrifying sentence that NASA continues to deny exists. "They're not just watching us from out there. They're already down here, and they've been waiting for us to join them in the dark." Story 2. Mission Specialist Viktor Petrov had been monitoring deep space communications for the Mars Colonial Initiative for over 8 months when the impossible transmissions began arriving. Viktor's job was routine: maintaining the communication relay between Earth and the growing research outposts on Mars, ensuring that the 47-minute signal delay didn't disrupt critical operations. He had processed thousands of routine messages, scientific data packets, and personal communications between astronauts and their families back home. But on October 15, 2019, Viktor received a response to a message he had never sent. The transmission came through on the official Mars communication frequency, properly encrypted with current security protocols, and bore Viktor's own digital signature. The message was addressed to Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Mars Research Station, but Viktor had never heard of Dr. Vasquez, and according to all mission records, no one by that name had ever been stationed on Mars. More disturbing still, the message contained detailed technical specifications for equipment that wouldn't be developed for another 3 years, written in Viktor's own communication style and signed with his personal authorization codes. Viktor initially assumed this was some kind of system glitch or perhaps a training simulation that had been accidentally routed through the live communication array. But when he ran diagnostic checks on all systems, everything appeared to be functioning perfectly. The message had definitely originated from his own terminal, sent at a timestamp that showed it had been transmitted 2 hours ago, during a time when Viktor had been in a mandatory sleep period and nowhere near the communication center. Over the following weeks, these phantom messages became more frequent and increasingly disturbing. Victor would arrive at his duty station to find dozens of outgoing transmissions in his personal queue, all sent during times when he had been asleep or off duty. The messages were addressed to people and facilities that didn't exist in any official records, discussing mission parameters and research projects that had never been authorized. Most unsettling of all, the messages were written in languages that Victor didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly when he read them. The alien languages flowed through his mind like forgotten memories suddenly returning, complex grammatical structures and vocabulary that felt familiar despite being completely foreign to human linguistic patterns. Victor began documenting these anomalous transmissions in a private log, careful not to include them in his official reports until he could understand what was happening. He discovered that the phantom messages contained increasingly personal information about his life on Earth, details about his childhood in rural Russia, his academic career, even intimate conversations with his wife that he had never shared with anyone. But the most terrifying aspect was that these messages were being answered. Responses would arrive on the Mars frequency from the non-existent recipients, written in the same alien languages, discussing Victor's personal life with an intimacy that only his closest family members could possess. The entities responding to these messages knew about his recurring nightmares from childhood, his secret fears about the isolation of deep space duty, and his growing concerns about the psychological effects of long-term space travel on human consciousness. Dr. Sarah Morrison, the station psychologist who reviewed Victor's case files after his emergency medical leave, noted that Victor's condition deteriorated rapidly once he began actively trying to communicate with whatever was intercepting his transmissions. Victor started staying awake for days at a time, monitoring the communication array and attempting to trace the source of the phantom messages. He became convinced that something was using the deep space communication network as a gateway, infiltrating human consciousness through the very technology designed to keep isolated astronauts connected to Earth. Victor's breakthrough came during his 15th consecutive hour of monitoring the communication array. He detected a pattern in the alien language responses that suggested they weren't just random communications. They were instructions, step-by-step procedures for modifying the communication equipment to create a more direct connection with whatever entities were on the other end. Despite every instinct telling him to stop, Victor found himself compelled to follow these instructions, his hands moving across the control panels as if guided by some external intelligence. The modifications were subtle but profound, involving frequency adjustments and signal processing changes that shouldn't have been possible with the available hardware. As Victor implemented the final modification, the communication array began receiving transmissions from multiple sources simultaneously, not just the Mars stations, but from deep space locations that corresponded to no known human installations. The messages poured in faster than Victor could process them, all written in the alien languages that his mind somehow translated automatically. The entities were discussing him specifically, referring to Victor as the conduit, and describing the communication array as the bridge between the watching and the watched. Victor realized with growing horror that he hadn't been intercepting alien communications. He had been selected as a communication node, a human interface that would allow these entities to establish permanent contact with Earth's technology networks. Victor's final report, submitted moments before his psychological breakdown, contained a terrifying revelation. The phantom messages weren't being sent from deep space at all. They were originating from Earth, from communication stations that wouldn't be built for decades in the future. The entities had somehow established contact with humanity's future colonies and were using that connection to communicate backward through time, using Victor as a temporal anchor point. The alien languages weren't from another species. They were evolved forms of human languages, changed by centuries of contact with entities that existed outside normal space-time. Victor had been receiving messages from humanity's own future, from colonists who had encountered something in deep space that had fundamentally altered their consciousness and communication methods. The final message Victor received before his breakdown was written in perfect contemporary Russian. "Victor, this is you, 50 years from now. Stop the modifications immediately. They're not aliens, they're us, after we found what's been waiting in the dark between the stars. If you complete the bridge, they'll have access to our past, and humanity will never have existed in the way we remember. Destroy the equipment now, before it's too late." Viktor Petrov was removed from duty and transferred to a classified medical facility where he remains under observation. All records of his phantom communications have been sealed, and the modified communication equipment was supposedly destroyed. However, mission specialists at other deep space installations have begun reporting similar phenomena. Messages in unknown languages arriving from non-existent sources, all containing the same urgent warning about something waiting in the darkness between the stars, something that humanity is destined to encounter but should never be allowed to communicate with our present-day technology. Story 3. Engineer Maria Santos was 3 weeks into her solo deep space maintenance mission when she first noticed the impossible trajectory changes in her spacecraft's navigation logs. Maria's assignment was routine: a 6-month solo journey to repair and upgrade a series of communication satellites positioned at the edge of the solar system's habitable zone. The work required absolute precision and complete focus, which is why these missions were always conducted alone, with minimal contact from Earth due to the communication delays involved. Maria had been selected for her exceptional technical skills and psychological stability, having completed 4 previous solo missions without incident. But during her daily navigation review on day 22, Maria discovered that her spacecraft had changed course 17 times during her mandatory sleep periods, executing complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for the automated systems to perform without direct human oversight. According to the navigation computer, these course corrections had been initiated by Maria herself, using her personal authorization codes and biometric signatures, all during times when she had been unconscious in her sleeping quarters. The flight path alterations were subtle but significant. Instead of following the predetermined route to the satellite array, her ship had been making detours to coordinate locations that corresponded to no known celestial objects or mission objectives. More disturbing still, the power consumption logs showed that during these mysterious navigation changes, the ship's life support systems had been drawing significantly more energy than required for a single occupant. Maria initially suspected a malfunction in the ship's computer systems, but multiple diagnostic runs revealed that all systems were operating within normal parameters. The navigation changes were being executed perfectly, with professional-level precision that matched Maria's own piloting skills exactly. When she attempted to override the autopilot and manually resumed the original course, she discovered that the ship's computer would not accept her commands, displaying error messages stating that conflicting authorization detected and primary pilot currently active. According to the ship's logs, Maria was already at the helm, making the navigation decisions that she had no memory of making. The psychological evaluation conducted after Maria's emergency return to Earth revealed that her sleep patterns had become increasingly irregular during the mission, with periods of unconsciousness lasting far longer than normal human sleep cycles required. Maria reported experiencing dreams of unprecedented vividness, during which she would find herself standing in the ship's control center, operating systems and making navigation decisions while feeling completely awake and alert. In these dreams, Maria was aware that she was sleeping in her quarters, but she was simultaneously conscious and active in the ship's control systems, as if her consciousness had been split between 2 different states of existence. But the most terrifying aspect of Maria's experience was the growing realization that during these extended sleep periods, something else had been inhabiting her body, using her hands to operate the ship's systems and her voice to record personal log entries that she had no memory of making. When Maria reviewed these phantom log entries, she heard her own voice discussing technical procedures and mission objectives that weren't part of her assignment, speaking with knowledge of star charts and navigation routes that she had never studied. The Phantom Maria spoke about the collection protocols and specimen transportation requirements, referring to her mission as a retrieval operation rather than a maintenance assignment. Dr. James Fletcher, the mission psychiatrist who debriefed Maria after her return, noted that her ship's internal surveillance footage showed disturbing evidence that supported her claims. The recordings revealed Maria moving through the ship during her supposed sleep periods, but her movements were unnaturally precise and mechanical, lacking the subtle variations and imperfections that characterize normal human behavior. More unsettling still, the surveillance footage showed Maria operating equipment and accessing computer systems that she had never been trained to use, performing complex technical procedures with expert proficiency while appearing to be in a trance-like state. The Phantom Maria would spend hours making modifications to the ship's interior, installing equipment and creating storage areas that served no apparent purpose, all while the real Maria remained unconscious in her sleeping quarters according to the life sign monitors. Maria's breaking point came during week 7 of the mission, when she discovered that the mysterious navigation changes had brought her ship to a location that didn't appear on any star charts, a region of space that was completely empty according to all astronomical surveys. But when Maria looked out the ship's observation windows, she saw structures in the distance, artificial constructions that resembled massive storage facilities or processing centers. The structures appeared to be ancient, built from materials that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making them visible only as darker shapes against the star field. As Maria watched in horror, she realized that her ship was being drawn toward one of these structures by some kind of tractor beam or gravitational manipulation technology. The ship's phantom pilot, the version of herself that operated during her sleep periods, had apparently been following a predetermined course to deliver her to these entities, whoever or whatever they were. Maria's final transmission to Earth, sent just before the ship's communication systems were disabled by external interference, contained a chilling revelation about the true purpose of her mission. According to the ship's modified navigation protocols, which Maria had discovered hidden in the computer's memory banks, her assignment hadn't been to repair satellites at all. The mission had been designed to deliver her to the entities that controlled the dark structures, using her as a test subject for experiments involving human consciousness transfer and biological modification. The fake maintenance mission had been a cover story, designed to ensure that Maria would travel willingly to the designated coordinates where the entities were waiting to collect her. But, most terrifying of all, Maria realized that she wasn't the first. The ship's hidden files contained records of dozens of previous maintenance missions, all following similar routes to the same empty regions of space, all involving solo pilots who had experienced the same consciousness-splitting phenomena that Maria was enduring. The entities had been collecting human subjects for an extended period, using them for experiments that involved separating consciousness from physical bodies and transferring human awareness into artificial containers or biological constructs. Maria Santos was rescued by an emergency retrieval mission that located her ship drifting in normal space, 3 months after her scheduled return date. Maria was found unconscious in her sleeping quarters, physically unharmed but with no memory of the final 6 weeks of her mission. The ship's navigation logs had been completely wiped, and all the mysterious equipment modifications had been removed so thoroughly that no trace of them remained. Maria was debriefed and returned to active duty after psychological counseling, with her experience officially classified as a case of acute isolation psychosis. However, deep space tracking stations have detected similar anomalous navigation patterns from other solo missions, always involving course changes to regions of space that appear empty on standard surveys, but which may contain structures too dark to be detected by conventional sensors. Story 4. Astronaut James O'Brien was 48 hours into his solo mission to repair a malfunctioning satellite array when he received the first distress call from himself. James was positioned 12,000 miles above Earth's surface, working methodically through a complex series of repairs on the communication satellites that provided internet connectivity to remote regions of the Pacific. The work was demanding but routine, requiring precise movements and constant communication with ground control to ensure each repair was completed according to strict safety protocols. James had performed similar missions dozens of times throughout his 15-year career, and he prided himself on maintaining perfect safety records and flawless execution of mission parameters. But at exactly 1,400 hours on day 2 of the mission, James's communication system received an emergency transmission on his personal frequency, encrypted with his own security codes and transmitted with the distinctive vocal patterns and speech rhythms that belonged to James himself. The voice coming through his headset was unmistakably his own, but it was speaking with desperate urgency, warning him about a catastrophic system failure that would occur in exactly 17 minutes unless he immediately aborted the current repair procedure and returned to his spacecraft. The future James described specific technical failures in precise detail, mentioning component serial numbers and failure sequences that the present James had no knowledge of, but which sounded completely authentic and technically accurate. More disturbing still, the transmission included personal details that only James could know: childhood memories, private conversations with his wife, and concerns about his career that he had never shared with anyone at Mission Control. Against every protocol and his own professional judgment, James found himself following the detailed instructions provided by his future self, abandoning the satellite repair and returning to his spacecraft with minutes to spare before the predicted system failure occurred exactly as the transmission had warned. The satellite array suffered a cascade failure that would have killed James instantly if he had remained at his work position, validating the impossible warning he had received from his own future voice. Over the following days, these temporal communications became more frequent and increasingly desperate. James would receive detailed warnings about equipment failures, course corrections, and safety hazards, all transmitted from versions of himself that existed hours or days in the future. Each transmission was more urgent than the last, with future James describing increasingly catastrophic scenarios that could only be avoided by taking specific actions in the present moment. The future versions of himself seemed to be experiencing a timeline where everything that could go wrong with the mission was going wrong. Simultaneously, life support failures, navigation system malfunctions, communication breakdowns, and structural damage to the spacecraft that threatened to strand James in deep space permanently. But the most terrifying aspect of these communications was that each time James followed the warnings and successfully avoided a predicted disaster, the next transmission would arrive describing an even worse catastrophe that his preventive actions had somehow caused. Future James would explain in increasingly panicked tones that avoiding one system failure had created cascade effects that led to multiple other failures, trapping him in a loop where every attempt to save himself resulted in new and more dangerous situations. The transmissions revealed that James was experiencing dozens of different timeline variations simultaneously, each one slightly different but all ending in his death unless he could find the precise sequence of actions that would allow him to survive and return to Earth safely. Dr. Rebecca Hayes, the mission psychologist who analyzed James's case after his emergency return, noted that the temporal paradoxes described in the transmissions were mathematically consistent and technically feasible, suggesting that James was either experiencing genuine contact with alternate versions of himself or was suffering from a form of psychosis so sophisticated that it could generate realistic technical scenarios beyond his conscious knowledge. The transmissions demonstrated knowledge of spacecraft systems and failure modes that James had never studied, as well as predictive capabilities that allowed the future versions of himself to accurately forecast equipment problems with precision timing. James's psychological state deteriorated rapidly as he became obsessed with following the increasingly complex instructions provided by his future selves, spending entire days trying to execute contradictory sets of preventive actions that different timeline versions of himself insisted were necessary for survival. James began recording detailed logs of each temporal communication, creating flowcharts and decision trees as he attempted to map the various timeline branches and identify the single sequence of actions that would lead to a successful mission completion. But the more James tried to optimize his decisions based on future warnings, the more chaotic and contradictory the communications became, with multiple versions of his future self arguing with each other through the radio system, each insisting that their timeline was the real one and that following the other version's advice would lead to certain death. The breaking point came when James received a transmission from a version of himself that claimed to be calling from 6 months in the future, long after the mission should have been completed. This future, James explained that he had been trapped in a temporal loop for months, repeating the same mission over and over again, with each iteration slightly different but always ending in failure and death, only to restart again from the beginning. The future James warned that the temporal communications themselves were the trap, that by listening to warnings from his future selves, present James had created a paradox that prevented the timeline from progressing naturally, trapping all versions of himself in an endless cycle of mission repetition. Future James begged his past self to stop listening to the temporal communications, to ignore all warnings and allow the mission to proceed according to its original parameters, even if that meant accepting whatever natural consequences might occur. James O'Brien was retrieved by emergency rescue when his spacecraft went silent for 72 hours, violating all communication protocols. James was found in a catatonic state, surrounded by hundreds of pages of handwritten notes documenting conversations with future versions of himself, including detailed technical diagrams and timeline charts that mapped out dozens of different mission scenarios. The rescue team reported that James's spacecraft showed evidence of repairs and modifications that weren't part of the original mission plan, as if James had been continuously working to prevent various system failures that never actually occurred. James was hospitalized for psychological evaluation and treatment, where he remained convinced that he was still receiving temporal communications from alternate versions of himself, all trapped in different variations of the same failed mission. The most disturbing aspect of James's case was discovered during the technical analysis of his spacecraft. The communication logs contained recordings of the temporal transmissions James claimed to have received, all featuring his own voice providing warnings and instructions. But analysis of the voice patterns revealed subtle differences that suggested the recordings were not of James's voice altered by equipment malfunction, but were actually recordings of a different person who sounded almost exactly like James but wasn't quite identical. Mission Control has quietly implemented new protocols requiring all solo mission communications to be continuously monitored by ground control, ostensibly for safety purposes. But the real reason is to detect any signs of temporal communication phenomena that might indicate that an astronaut has become trapped in a causality loop similar to the one that affected James O'Brien. Story 5. Dr. Kenji Nakamura had been conducting geological surveys on the Shackleton lunar base for 6 weeks when ground-penetrating radar revealed impossible structures beneath the moon's surface. Kenji's mission was part of the Advanced Lunar Colonization Project, tasked with identifying suitable locations for expanded underground facilities that would house the next generation of permanent lunar residents. The work required extensive subsurface mapping using sophisticated radar equipment that could penetrate hundreds of meters into the lunar regolith, creating detailed three-dimensional models of underground rock formations, lava tubes, and potential construction sites. Kenji had mapped over 40 square kilometers of lunar terrain without incident, documenting the expected geological features and identifying several promising locations for future excavation. But during a routine survey of the area directly beneath the main habitat modules, Kenji's equipment detected architectural structures that perfectly mirrored the layout of the base above ground. The subsurface radar images showed corridors, chambers, and equipment bays arranged in exactly the same configuration as the lunar base, positioned precisely 100 meters below the surface level. Initially, Kenji assumed this was some kind of equipment malfunction or signal reflection that was creating false images of the base's own structure. But repeated scans using different equipment and alternative scanning frequencies consistently revealed the same underground architecture, complete with structural details that matched the base's construction specifications down to the smallest maintenance conduits and storage areas. More disturbing still, the underground structures appeared to be older than the surface base, showing signs of erosion and environmental damage that would have required centuries of exposure to develop, despite the fact that the lunar base had been constructed only 18 months earlier. Kenji's initial excitement about discovering natural cave formations that happened to resemble artificial construction quickly transformed into growing unease as he realized that the underground structures weren't just similar to the base layout. They were identical in every detail, including recent modifications and equipment installations that had been completed only weeks before Kenji's arrival. The subsurface scans revealed underground versions of rooms that had been added to the surface base during the current mission, suggesting that somehow the underground structures were changing to match alterations made to the surface facilities in real time. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, Kenji's supervisor at Lunar Base Operations, initially dismissed his findings as sensor artifacts or psychological effects related to prolonged isolation in the lunar environment. But when Kenji provided detailed three-dimensional mapping data, showing precise architectural correspondence between surface and subsurface structures, Rodriguez authorized a limited drilling operation to verify whether actual physical structures existed at the indicated depths. The drilling operation confirmed Kenji's worst fears. Physical structures did exist exactly where the radar had indicated, constructed from materials that appeared identical to those used in the surface base but showing clear signs of extreme age and environmental degradation. The drill samples contained fragments of metal alloys, composite materials, and electronic components that matched the specifications of current lunar base construction. But isotopic analysis revealed that the materials were far older than should have been possible, some showing evidence of exposure to cosmic radiation for thousands of years. Kenji became obsessed with mapping the full extent of the underground structures, working 18-hour shifts to complete comprehensive scans of the entire area surrounding the lunar base. His findings revealed that the subsurface structures extended far beyond the boundaries of the surface base, forming a vast underground complex that included facilities and equipment bays that didn't exist in the current base design, but appeared to represent planned future expansions that were still in the early design phases back on Earth. The underground base contained perfect replicas of facilities that existed only as preliminary blueprints in the mission planning documents, constructed with exact specifications for equipment that hadn't yet been manufactured or delivered to the lunar surface. But the most terrifying discovery came when Kenji detected signs of recent activity within the underground structures. Power consumption readings from the base's electrical systems showed energy draws that were twice the expected levels for the surface facilities, suggesting that the underground base was somehow connected to and drawing power from the surface electrical grid. Environmental sensors detected air circulation patterns that indicated the underground structures were pressurized and maintaining life support systems, despite having no known connection to the surface base's environmental controls. Thermal imaging revealed heat signatures consistent with human habitation in the underground facilities, showing patterns of movement and activity that suggested multiple people were living and working in the subsurface base. Kenji's psychological evaluation, conducted after his emergency medical evacuation, revealed that during his final weeks on the lunar surface, he had become convinced that the underground base was inhabited by alternate versions of the surface base crew, including an underground version of himself who was conducting the same geological surveys but from the subsurface perspective. Kenji reported hearing voices and equipment noise coming from beneath the base's floor panels, sounds that corresponded to the daily activities and work schedules of the surface crew but seemed to be occurring in the underground facilities. He became convinced that every action taken by the surface crew was being mirrored simultaneously by their underground counterparts, creating a parallel existence where two identical versions of the lunar base operation were running simultaneously in the same location. The breaking point came when Kenji discovered personal items in the drill samples that belonged to members of the current crew: equipment, serial numbers, personal belongings, and even handwritten notes that matched the handwriting of people currently living in the surface base. The underground structures contained evidence that the subsurface crew had been living and working beneath the base for years, despite the fact that the surface base had been operational for less than 2 years. Kenji's final report, submitted hours before his psychological breakdown, contained a terrifying theory about the true nature of the lunar base construction project. According to Kenji's analysis, the surface base hadn't been built on empty lunar terrain at all. It had been constructed directly on top of an existing underground facility that had been deliberately concealed from the mission planners. The underground base represented a previous lunar colonization attempt that had been abandoned or suppressed from official records, but the inhabitants had never been evacuated and had continued their operations in the subsurface facilities. Kenji believed that the surface base crew were unknowingly living as prisoners above their underground predecessors, with every aspect of their mission being monitored and controlled by the entities that inhabited the subsurface structures. Dr. Kenji Nakamura was returned to Earth for psychiatric treatment after attempting to use mining equipment to excavate an access tunnel to the underground structures, claiming he needed to make contact with the subsurface crew to coordinate joint operations between the two bases. All of Kenji's geological survey data was classified, and subsequent missions to the lunar base have been prohibited from conducting any subsurface scanning or drilling operations. However, power consumption at the lunar base continues to exceed expected levels, and crew members have reported unexplained sounds and vibrations that seem to originate from beneath the base's foundation, suggesting that whatever Kenji discovered in the underground structures is still active and may be attempting to establish more direct contact with the surface facilities. Story 6. Captain Rebecca Torres discovered the extra crew member during the 3rd week of what should have been a routine 4-person mission to establish a research outpost on Europa, one of Jupiter's largest moons. The mission roster had been finalized months in advance, with Rebecca commanding a carefully selected team of 3 specialists: Dr. Marcus Webb, the team's xenobiologist, engineer Lisa Chang, responsible for life support systems, and Communications Officer David Park, who maintained contact with Earth during the 18-month journey. Rebecca had worked with each team member on previous missions and knew their capabilities, personalities, and working habits intimately. The crew quarters were designed specifically for 4 people, with individual sleeping compartments, personal storage areas, and duty assignments that required precise coordination to maintain the spacecraft's complex systems during the long journey to Europa. But on day 21 of the mission, Rebecca noticed a 5th name appearing consistently in the ship's automated duty logs, work schedules, and resource allocation records. Dr. Elena Vasquez was listed as the mission's chief medical officer, assigned to sleeping compartment C5 with complete personnel files, medical certifications, and mission specialization records that were indistinguishable from those of the other crew members. According to the ship's computer systems, Dr. Vasquez had been part of the mission from the beginning, participating in all pre-flight training, medical evaluations, and mission briefings. Her biometric data was registered in the ship's security systems, her personal belongings were cataloged in the inventory manifests, and her dietary preferences and medical requirements were included in the mission provisioning calculations. More disturbing still, the ship's surveillance footage showed Dr. Vasquez moving through the corridors, working in the laboratories, and participating in daily crew meetings alongside Rebecca and the other team members. But none of the 4 crew members had any memory of Dr. Vasquez existing, and there was no 5th sleeping compartment or duty station assigned to anyone by that name. Rebecca initially suspected a computer malfunction that was generating false personnel records, but when she confronted her team about the discrepancy, Each crew member insisted that they clearly remembered Dr. Vasquez and couldn't understand why Rebecca was questioning her presence on the mission. According to Marcus, Lisa, and David, Elena Vasquez had been an integral part of the team for over a year, participating in mission planning, training exercises, and pre-flight preparation alongside the rest of the crew. They described detailed conversations with Dr. Vasquez, shared work experiences, and personal interactions that demonstrated intimate familiarity with her personality, professional background, and role in the mission. When Rebecca insisted that no such person existed, and that the mission had been planned for only 4 crew members, her team began expressing concern about Rebecca's mental state, suggesting that the stress of command might be causing memory problems or psychological difficulties related to long-term space travel. Dr. Sarah Kim, the mission psychiatrist who later analyzed the case files, noted that the surveillance footage clearly showed all 4 crew members interacting normally with a 5th person who was visible in the recordings but whose face was always obscured by camera angles, lighting conditions, or equipment that blocked the view. The footage showed the Phantom crew member performing complex technical tasks, participating in group discussions, and moving through the spacecraft with complete familiarity of the layout and systems. More unsettling still, the recordings revealed that this 5th person knew intimate details about each crew member's personal lives, family backgrounds, and professional histories that would have required months of close collaboration to acquire. Rebecca became increasingly isolated from her team as she insisted that Dr. Vasquez didn't exist, while the other crew members continued to interact normally with the Phantom team member and grew more concerned about Rebecca's apparent inability to see or remember their colleague. The ship's medical bay contained complete health records for Dr. Vasquez, including recent medical examinations, prescription medications, and treatment notes that detailed ongoing care for conditions that Rebecca had never heard discussed. Personal items belonging to Dr. Vasquez appeared throughout the ship: clothing, books, scientific equipment, and family photographs that the other crew members recognized and could discuss in detail, describing how Dr. Vasquez had shared stories about the people and places depicted in the images. Rebecca's investigation revealed that the Phantom crew members' personnel file contained information that none of the actual crew members could have known, including detailed knowledge of classified mission objectives that hadn't been shared with the team, technical specifications for equipment that hadn't yet been installed on the spacecraft, and scientific data about Europa's subsurface oceans that wouldn't be available until after the mission's arrival and initial exploration phase. Dr. Vasquez appeared to know things about the mission that even Rebecca, as mission commander, had never been told, suggesting access to information sources beyond what any human crew member should possess. The psychological pressure of being the only crew member who couldn't see or remember Dr. Vasquez began affecting Rebecca's performance as mission commander, causing her to question her own sanity and memory reliability. Rebecca started keeping detailed written logs documenting every interaction with her crew, trying to identify when and how Dr. Vasquez participated in conversations and activities that Rebecca couldn't observe directly. But the other crew members became increasingly frustrated with Rebecca's behavior, interpreting her documentation efforts as paranoid delusions and expressing concern that their commander was suffering from a serious psychological breakdown that could compromise the entire mission. The breaking point came when Rebecca discovered that Dr. Vasquez's personnel file contained detailed psychological evaluations and behavioral assessments of all 4 actual crew members, including private information about their fears, motivations, and interpersonal relationships that could only have been gathered through extensive observation and analysis. The Phantom crew member knew about Rebecca's recurring nightmares about equipment failures, Marcus's anxiety about discovering hostile life forms on Europa, Lisa's concerns about her family's financial problems back on Earth, and David's secret doubts about his professional qualifications for the mission. Dr. Vasquez had been studying the crew with the thoroughness of a researcher analyzing test subjects, documenting their behavior patterns, emotional responses, and psychological vulnerabilities with scientific precision. Rebecca's final log entry, recorded just before the mission's emergency abort and return to Earth, contained a terrifying realization about the true nature of Dr. Vasquez's presence on the mission. According to Rebecca's analysis, the Phantom crew member wasn't a hallucination or computer malfunction. She was an external entity that had infiltrated the mission for the purpose of studying human behavior during long-term space travel, using the other crew members as unwitting test subjects while remaining invisible to Rebecca as the control group. The entity had somehow inserted itself into the ship's records and the crew's memories, creating a perfect cover identity that allowed it to observe and analyze human psychology under the extreme conditions of deep space exploration. Rebecca believed that Dr. Vasquez was collecting data about human responses to isolation, stress, and the psychological challenges of interplanetary travel, possibly as preparation for future contact or infiltration of Earth-based human populations. The mission was terminated early when Rebecca's behavior became increasingly erratic, and she began attempting to prove Dr. Vasquez's non-existence by trying to physically interact with the Phantom crew member, leading to confrontations that the other crew members interpreted as Rebecca attacking empty air while insisting she was fighting with their colleague. All 4 crew members were debriefed extensively after their return to Earth, with Rebecca receiving psychiatric treatment for what was officially diagnosed as command stress-induced psychosis, while the other 3 crew members were cleared for future missions after routine psychological evaluations. However, subsequent analysis of the mission records revealed that the ship's life support systems had been consuming resources calculated for 5 people throughout the entire journey, and the spacecraft's mass distribution readings were consistent with carrying an additional crew member who wasn't accounted for in the official mission manifests. Story 7. Astronaut David Kim was monitoring humanity's deep space communication array when he began receiving responses to messages that wouldn't be sent for another 47 years. David's assignment at the Kepler Deep Space Communication Station involved maintaining the massive radio telescope arrays that broadcast Earth's exploratory signals toward potentially habitable exoplanets, part of humanity's ongoing search for extraterrestrial intelligence and suitable worlds for future colonization. The work required David to coordinate the transmission of carefully crafted messages containing mathematical concepts, scientific data, and cultural information designed to demonstrate human intelligence and peaceful intentions to any alien civilizations that might intercept the signals. These messages were transmitted toward star systems hundreds of light-years away, with the understanding that any response would take centuries to reach Earth, making David's work more symbolic than practical for current generations. But during a routine maintenance check of the primary transmission array, David detected incoming signals on the same frequencies used for outbound messaging, carrying responses that appeared to be direct replies to Earth's transmissions. The responses contained mathematical proofs, scientific formulas, and technological specifications that were far beyond current human understanding, written in a combination of mathematical notation and symbolic logic that David's training allowed him to partially interpret. More disturbing still, the incoming messages were time-stamped with transmission dates that were decades in the future, suggesting that whoever was responding to Earth's signals had received messages that humanity hadn't yet sent and was replying to them before the original transmissions had even been composed. Dr. Angela Martinez, the project's chief linguist who analyzed David's recordings, confirmed that the alien responses demonstrated knowledge of human scientific concepts, cultural references, and linguistic patterns that wouldn't be included in Earth's deep space messages for several more decades. The responses referenced scientific discoveries that humanity hadn't yet made, technological innovations that were still theoretical concepts, and cultural developments that were still emerging in contemporary human society. The alien entities seemed to be receiving Earth's messages from a future timeline and responding to them in the present, creating a communication loop that violated every known principle of causality and information transmission across interstellar distances. David became obsessed with decoding the alien responses, working around the clock to translate the mathematical concepts and symbolic representations that filled the incoming messages. The aliens were providing detailed instructions for advanced technologies, including faster-than-light communication systems, energy generation methods that could power entire civilizations, and medical techniques that could extend human lifespan indefinitely. But embedded within these beneficial technologies were warnings about humanity's future expansion into space, describing catastrophic encounters with hostile alien species, environmental disasters on Earth that would force mass evacuation to other worlds, and social conflicts that would arise from humanity's contact with advanced alien civilizations. The most terrifying aspect of the alien communications was their growing urgency as the messages continued arriving over a period of weeks. The entities were describing increasingly desperate situations in humanity's future, warning about a cascade of disasters that would begin with humanity's first contact with alien life and escalate through decades of poor decisions, technological misuse, and interstellar conflicts that would ultimately threaten the survival of human civilization. The aliens insisted that they were trying to prevent these catastrophes by providing advanced technology and strategic guidance to present-day humanity, but each message contained more dire warnings about the consequences of following their advice. David's psychological evaluation revealed that the stress of processing these apocalyptic predictions was causing severe anxiety and paranoid ideation, as he became convinced that humanity was being manipulated by entities with unclear motives who had access to knowledge of Earth's future timeline. David began to suspect that the aliens weren't trying to help humanity at all, but were using their knowledge of future events to manipulate present-day human development in ways that would serve their own interests. The alien messages contained subtle inconsistencies and contradictory advice that suggested they might be deliberately steering humanity toward the very disasters they claimed to be preventing, using the pretense of helpful guidance to ensure that future events would unfold according to their preferred timeline. Dr. Rebecca Stone, the mission psychologist who treated David after his breakdown, noted that the alien communications demonstrated an intimate understanding of human psychology, using persuasive techniques and emotional manipulation strategies that were perfectly calibrated to David's personal fears and professional insecurities. The messages gradually shifted from providing technological benefits to making increasingly specific demands for changes to Earth's space exploration programs, military policies, and scientific research priorities. The aliens claimed that these changes were necessary to prevent the catastrophic future they had witnessed, but their recommendations would have required David to violate numerous security protocols and share classified information with unauthorized personnel. The breaking point came when David received a message that contained detailed personal information about his family, friends, and childhood experiences that no alien civilization could have obtained through normal observation or communication. The message described intimate moments from David's past, private conversations he had never shared with anyone, and even his unspoken thoughts and feelings about his work at the communication station. The aliens revealed that they hadn't been communicating with Earth from distant star systems at all. They had been observing human civilization from much closer proximity, possibly from within the solar system itself, using advanced technology to monitor and analyze every aspect of human behavior and communication. David realized with growing horror that the future timeline the aliens described wasn't a prediction based on their advanced knowledge. It was a plan they had been implementing through decades of subtle manipulation and influence over human development. The aliens had been guiding humanity's technological and social evolution for generations, steering human civilization toward a future that would serve their purposes while making humans believe they were making independent decisions about their own development. The catastrophic events the aliens warned about weren't natural consequences of human expansion into space. They were deliberate outcomes that the aliens had engineered to justify their continued intervention in human affairs. David's final transmission, sent using an emergency override of the communication array's security systems, contained a desperate warning to Earth's governments and scientific institutions about the true nature of the alien contact. According to David's analysis, the entities communicating through the deep space array weren't aliens at all, but were representatives of a human civilization from the far future that had developed time travel technology and was attempting to alter their own past by manipulating the development of present-day humanity. The future humans were trapped in a timeline where their civilization had made catastrophic mistakes that led to suffering and extinction, and they were trying to prevent those outcomes by providing technological guidance to their ancestors, creating a temporal paradox that threatened to destroy both timelines simultaneously. David Kim was removed from duty and transferred to a secure psychiatric facility after attempting to destroy the communication array to prevent further contact with the temporal entities. All records of the alien communications were classified under national security protocols, and the Deep Space Communication Project was quietly discontinued under the pretext of budget constraints and shifting research priorities. However, similar communication phenomena have been reported at other deep space monitoring facilities around the world, always involving messages that demonstrate impossible knowledge of future events and technological capabilities that exceed current human understanding, suggesting that the temporal manipulation David discovered may be a global phenomenon that continues to influence humanity's development in ways that remain hidden from public knowledge.